China's move came quietly, without spectacle, without open confrontation, and without the dramatic build-up that usually precedes a global crisis. One morning, before most of the world was awake, shipping companies, port authorities, and maritime trackers began noticing unusual activity along one of the world's most essential trade routes. Cargo vessels were being directed through new security corridors. Chinese naval ships were repositioning with deliberate precision, and commercial ports, some privately owned, some jointly operated, suddenly announced updated procedures that required compliance with Chinese maritime authorities. What appeared at first to be a routine security update was, in reality, the execution of a long-planned strategy. China had taken control of a global artery that the entire world depends on, and it did so without firing a single shot. The shockwave began slowly. A handful of vessel captains reported delays and new checkpoints. Insurance companies hesitated to cover shipments until the situation became clearer. Logistics giants temporarily paused routes, fearing they could be caught in a geopolitical tug-of-war. And within hours, markets began to tremble. The price of oil ticked up, shipping futures spiked, investors fled towards safe assets. It didn't take long before the realization set in. This wasn't a drill, nor was it a symbolic show of force. China had effectively seized control of a critical route that underpins trillions of dollars of global trade. Please, while you are here, click on the subscribe button, like and share, so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The United States was caught flat-footed. Statements from Washington were hesitant, unclear, and contradictory. The initial reaction described the situation as manageable, but as reports grew more severe, the tone changed. American officials met behind closed doors, scrambling to understand how China managed to coordinate such a complex maneuver across multiple ports, multiple governments, and multiple regions without sparking early alarms. Some American intelligence analysts admitted what many feared. The signs had been there for years, but the US had underestimated the scale of China's preparation. For 2 decades, China had been playing a long game. While the world debated its rise, Beijing quietly built an international network of influence through port acquisitions, infrastructure funding, security agreements, and strategic loans. Many developing nations accepted Chinese financing when Western institutions hesitated or demanded tougher conditions. In return, China gained footholds in key maritime regions, access to ports, data control, long-term leases, and diplomatic leverage that Western governments often brushed aside as soft power. But the pieces were not soft. They were structural, foundational, and meticulously arranged for a moment exactly like this. The trade route China now controlled was only one part of a much larger strategy. Ports in East Africa, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, the Indian Ocean, and the Mediterranean were all interconnected through the Belt and Road Initiative. These ports were built with Chinese money, Chinese construction firms, Chinese equipment, and often with agreements that allowed Beijing to intervene if security conditions required it. Today, that clause became reality. While China activated its network, the US found itself surrounded by uncertainty. Military leadership debated sending ships to reassert freedom of navigation, but advisors warned such a move could escalate beyond control. Diplomats pushed for international condemnation, but allies were reluctant. Europe was divided. The Middle East was neutral, and many African and Asian partners argued that China's presence was stabilizing rather than threatening. The US had the power to challenge China militarily, but lacked the global consensus needed to do so politically. In Europe, officials issued cautious statements urging restraint and transparency, but avoided accusing China of aggression. The European economy depends heavily on Asian imports, and many countries feared retaliation if they challenged Beijing too directly. Behind closed doors, some European leaders even admitted that China's takeover might be more predictable and organized than the fragmented status quo the world was used to. In the Middle East, energy exporters saw opportunity. If China redirected trade flows, new partnerships and pipelines could emerge. African coastal nations with Chinese-funded ports defended Beijing's actions, emphasizing the economic benefits they had received. Southeast Asian countries were the most conflicted. They rely on the US for military protection, but depend on China for economic survival. Their statements were vague, cautious, and deliberately balanced. Meanwhile, multinational corporations entered crisis mode. Companies that rely on predictable shipping schedules, electronics manufacturers, retail giants, energy firms, agricultural exporters were forced to redesign their logistics networks overnight. Longer routes meant higher costs, delays meant shortages, and uncertainty meant volatility that would trickle down to consumers worldwide. As the world struggled to respond, many analysts tried to explain why China chose this exact moment. The answer appears to be a combination of global distraction, domestic pressure, and strategic timing. Western nations were fractured by political polarization, economic challenges, and ongoing conflicts. China's slowing economy increased the need for a bold, unifying action that projected strength. And above all, Beijing sensed an opportunity to test American resolve. If China could assert control over a major trade route without immediate pushback, it would send a powerful signal to the world that US leadership was no longer guaranteed. While you are here, click on the subscribe button, like and share so you never miss anything of our upcoming videos. Inside Beijing, officials framed the move as a necessary step to maintain stability, prevent piracy, and ensure safe passage for commercial vessels. Chinese media emphasized the idea that Western powers had long exploited international trade routes and that China was simply bringing order where it was lacking. But the world saw something different, a demonstration of strength wrapped in diplomatic language, a message that China was now willing to shape global trade on its own terms. The implications are staggering. Trade routes that have remained open for decades under US naval dominance are now effectively under China's influence. Smaller nations must rethink their foreign policy strategies. Corporations must adapt to new rules. And the US must confront a painful reality. China has developed the ability to project power far beyond its borders through infrastructure, economics, and strategic partnerships rather than through direct military confrontation. This moment could reshape the global order. If the United States escalates, the world risks a confrontation that could disrupt global trade and trigger broader instability. If the US hesitates, China's influence becomes permanent, altering the balance of power for decades. And if the world remains divided, China's model, economic leverage paired with strategic presence, may become the new norm. The world is now watching to see how Washington will respond. Every statement from the White House, every movement of US naval vessels, and every diplomatic meeting is under intense scrutiny. Allies are waiting to see whether America can lead. Rivals are watching for signs of weakness, and nations caught in the middle are calculating which superpower will ultimately shape the future. China's move may not have involved missiles, troops, or open conflict, but the effect is just as profound. It challenged the foundations of international trade, exposed divisions among Western allies, showcased China's long-term strategy, and forced the United States to confront the limits of its influence. Global trade depends on predictability. Supply chains depend on stability. And for decades, the world assumed the US would always be the guarantor of that stability. Today proved that assumption is no longer guaranteed. What happens next will determine the future of global power. If the US chooses confrontation, the world could be thrown into economic chaos. If the US chooses diplomacy, China may solidify its control. If allies fail to unite, the world may witness the emergence of a multipolar order defined not by Western leadership, but by competing spheres of influence. China has made its move. The structure of global trade has shifted, and the old world order, built on American dominance, open sea lanes, and predictable alliances, has begun to crack. What replaces it remains uncertain. But one thing is clear. This moment will be remembered as a turning point. A moment when power quietly changed hands. A moment when strategy triumphed over complacency. A moment when the world realized that global leadership is never guaranteed. It is taken, and China has just taken it. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, like and share so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos.